Russian Federal Security Service officially announced that 8 Russian citizens have returned to their homeland following a prisoner exchange between Moscow and the West in Ankara on Thursday. This is part of a prisoner exchange where Moscow has released 16 foreign nationals in what has been described as the biggest prisoner exchange since the Cold War. Is this a welcome sign of diplomacy between the West and Russia? Let's start with you, Martin.
I think we can say that it's a step in the right direction. Because of the Ukraine war, because of a number of agreements that the Russians had with America, test ban treaties, for example, exchange of information on weapons. All of these agreements have been sort of slowly unwritten and unwound. Of course, relations with Russia have been at an all-time low. And I think we're in a period now where a lot of people around the world, and I think the Russians included, are basically waiting for the US elections to produce a Trump victory. And this has created a certain impasse, I would say, a certain a pause for many geopolitical ideas to come forth. And I think the idea that this prisoner exchange, hostage exchange happening, and the Wall Street Journal journalists being returned, I think is also very, very encouraging. So I think we can be cautiously optimistic. I think this was a good move by both sides, but in particular, Putin, I think it's a very smart move at this right moment. The time was right, and we can be relatively positive, I would say.
George?
Well, it's very hard to say. Obviously, it's there's a humanitarian aspect to it. In the case of the most prominent of the Americans, Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, and of course Paul Whelan, who's been now in prison for 5 years. So there's a humanitarian aspect that they're released. Whether it portends anything more is unknowable at this stage, because let's remember, during the Cold War, there were regular exchanges of prisoners, and particularly of spies. I mean, the most famous one, of course, took place in 1962 between U-2 pilot Gary Powers, who had been shot down because he was spying on the Soviet Union, and he was exchanged for Rudolf Abel, and that set the pattern of regular spy exchanges. So in the UK, you had the Portland spy ring. A number of figures there had been imprisoned, including the man known as Gordon Lonsdale. The Russians know him as Konon Molody. And there was a lot of negotiations involved in releasing them. And there was an exchange eventually for a British lecturer, Gerald Brooke, that took place in the late 1960s. But none of those events led to any significant improvement in relations between the West and the Soviet Union. One should, I think, also say, by the by, is the way the media cover this. They invariably assume that, of course, Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan were wrongfully imprisoned, and they may have been. However, we can't really make that assumption. I mean, we know Gershkovich was a fluent Russian speaker, very anti-Russian. He grew up in a household. These were Jews who had left the Soviet Union. He was born in New Jersey. His political biases were obvious from the reports that he had filed for the Wall Street Journal. And then he went to this essentially military-industrial town, Yekaterinburg, where, I mean, what they do there is make missiles and tanks. And he started, asking locals all sorts of questions about production lines and, how many tanks are you producing? What's the tank inventory, the missile inventory? Well, you don't go around doing that kind of thing, asking those questions in the middle of a war and expect the government to treat you particularly favorably. Now, was he doing it at the behest of foreign intelligence services? Maybe. We can't rule this out. Were the editors who sent him on this assignment, were they cooperating with foreign intelligence services? Maybe. We can't rule it out. But it's just interesting how it's assumed. Well, of course, he was just a bona fide reporter. Well, how would Americans respond to a Russian reporter poking around in a military industrial facility in the United States, asking all sorts of questions from a fluent English speaker, moreover? I don't think the United States would look upon this particularly favorably. But to go back to your original question, we don't know. We can ask you, it's possible that Biden, on the way out the door, wants to settle all kinds of outstanding issues, including the Ukraine war. I wouldn't bet on it. I think that's unlikely, but it's not impossible that he's got 6 months to go and he just wants to settle everything. He's not going to suffer too many adverse consequences as the man who betrayed Ukraine, the man who lost Ukraine, in the way that Harris would if she were president, and in the way Trump would if he were president.
Yeah, that's some excellent points, as always. I mean, Biden, basically, he thanked his allies. He said it was the toughest call to release the prisoners. And basically, there were 24 detainees from 7 countries who were released. 10 people, including 2 minors, were relocated to Russia. It's taken about 18 months in the making. It's believed to have hinged on Moscow's demand for the return of the hitman, Vadim Krasikov, who was serving a life sentence in Germany. A very complex deal, which involved long, tortuous negotiations and clandestine meetings. You have to sort of ask, however, now that Putin has done this, will he be saying, well, this works, arresting foreign citizens, putting them in jail, keeping them for barter? That's a good way to exert pressure on an enemy. What's your take on that, Martin?
It's the lowest common denominator, unfortunately, when relations are so bad. Western press tends to be very scornful of the Iranians doing this practice all the time, of just habitually arresting foreigners and keeping them as a sort of a collateral for negotiations for their own benefit. But when there's no relations, when relations are so bad, what can you expect? And unfortunately, this is an indication of the relations between West and Russia hitting an all-time low now, which we hope can't last forever. I think George is probably right. I think Biden does want to clean out his backyard. I would disagree with him on the issue of Ukraine. I would have a wager. I would wager a crate of Guinness, Andrew, that
another one.
Biden will try and wrap up Ukraine for the simple reason that he is vain and he will not want his legacy being tarnished by a Trump administration, which will open up all sorts of investigations and cans of worms. Trump has made calls to Zelensky. There seems to be a comfort there, a certain proximity which works between the two of them. And who knows what the terms of a deal will be. Maybe in the small print of a peace deal, Trump will say, oh, and by the way, I want a full investigation on everything that Biden was involved in Ukraine, and Zelensky won't have anything to do with it. So maybe this is I'm speculating, but maybe this is on Biden's mind. He's thinking of clearing out everything and leaving on a relatively good note.
Oh, I have no doubt at all that's exactly what he wants to try and do. He's thinking about his legacy. The threat of basically having Amendment 25 to drive him out was undoubtedly what caused him to step aside and let Kamala, as her name is, sort of step into the running. It was interesting going to many different studios. They all handed out these badges and what it means for journalists. I stand with Evan. There we go. That's what they do on that sort of basis. And this is the real thing, isn't it? What does it mean, finally, before the break, for journalists now? What's your take on that, George?
Well, of course, journalists are vulnerable. I mean, when we've seen what happens in the Middle East and in Ukraine. I mean, it's worse than there are worse things than getting kidnapped and held for barter. You could get killed. So it's a rough life if you're a serious journalist. You're in very dangerous zones. now the issue of the abductions and then the use of people for barter, I think that practice will continue. You obviously have adversaries, and when one adversary power arrests and puts on trial the citizen of the adversary, then the adversary will retaliate. Now, in the case of Vadim Krasikov, now whether he was acting at the behest of the FSB or not, we don't know. He may have just been a freelance assassin, so agitated by this fact, by this Chechen terrorist living a good life in Germany, and that he had killed so many Russians, that he took it upon himself to assassinate this Chechen. The Russians felt right away that this is a good, patriotic Russian citizen who was carrying out his patriotic duty to liquidate a terrorist. And almost from the beginning, when the Germans arrested him, imprisoned him, I don't know, it was I think life imprisonment, that the Russians were determined to get him out, because essentially the Germans were punishing a good Russian noble patriot who wanted to avenge the deaths of fellow Russians. So yeah, there was obviously an incentive for the Russians to seize people and use them as part of the exchange to get Krasikov out. But incidentally, in the other cases of the Russians who were handed back to Russia, the case against them seemed awfully thin. I mean, if you look at these reports, they look to me like they were entirely cooked up in this whole NATO war, Cold War hysteria, when there was really no evidence at all against them. They were essentially kind of, the Poles arrested a Russian journalist and claimed, oh yeah, he's of course a spy, but they never presented any evidence to show that he was actually a spy. Same with this couple in Slovenia that was released. No evidence was presented against them, and it's very convenient that when they finally found them guilty and sentenced them to 19 months in prison, it was 19 months as time served. In other words, since they had been held in custody for 19 months, so very conveniently they said time served, so you can go. So, and again, when you look at some of these stories, you find Bellingcat. Bellingcat always seems to be at the center of all these stories. So now Bellingcat is entirely just a front for the Western intelligence services. And strangely enough, they're the ones providing evidence against all these Russians who have been arrested, in various parts of Europe. It's that we should not just simply assume, oh well, we've got these were good guys who were arrested by the Russians, whereas the Russians that we released were bad guys. Frankly, the Western powers have not made much of a case against many of these Russians.
Yeah, so some excellent points as always. Well,